Here, on the very edge of the Romney Marsh, lies the ancient town of Rye, one that appears hardly changed over many centuries. On approaching closer, battlements and fortifications are a reminder that this coastline of southern England was under constant threat of invasion. Today there's still an invasion, though of a friendlier kind, from the thousands of visitors that crowd the town every year. It's not only the timeless beauty of the ancient town that gives Rye special appeal, but its seafaring heritage too, even though its harbour now lies 2 miles away. The sea that once almost surrounded the town has long since gone. Instead, Rye now looks out across mudflats and water meadows, and a river that runs into the English Channel. Entry to Rye in medieval times was through this land gate, built by Edward III around 1340. It's the only survivor of 4 gateways that once ringed the town. The clock is of a much later date, a memorial to Prince Albert, placed here in 1863. Rye was once a part of France, owned by a Norman monastery.
In 1247, Rye, for the first time since King Canute's time, was owned by England. Prior to that, it had been owned by the Abbey of Fécamp, a French abbey, which was very favoured by the Norman kings. But it became inconvenient when France was fighting England to have a bit of French land in England. After that, we then had to build walls because the French decided to attack us again and again and again. In 1377, they actually came and they stole the church bells and they burnt the town, and only 4 stone buildings were left. That was the part of the church, the castle, the Landgate Tower, and the old Friars of the Sack, which incidentally had been from mixed monks and nuns together.
Why were they called Friars of the Sack? Because they chose to wear sackcloth habits, and this is the house built by the friars in 1263. In 1287, a violent storm completely destroyed the neighbouring town of Winchelsea and diverted the course of the River Rother so that it flowed to the sea at Rye. This made Rye into a formidable harbour, giving the town both prosperity and power. Even today, small vessels still make their way up this river to where the Tillingham, Brede and Rother combine to create a moat around 2/3 of the town. In the 16th century, the sea receded and finally the harbour silted up. Where merchant ships once moored, pleasure craft now lie at anchor beside bond houses once filled with cargoes brought from continental Europe. It's hard now to imagine the relentless activity of seamen, labourers and carters that crowded this area. This was once the busiest place in Rye. Records show that upwards of 200 ships regularly anchored here at what was the Strand Gate. These playing fields skirting the River Rother were once salterns, banked fields where salt water was continuously allowed to flood and evaporate. It produced that invaluable commodity, salt. Even as late as 1823, the salts were covered by the sea at high tide. The river here at the eastern end of the town is the province of the fishermen, still carrying on a trade that's been handed down from generation to generation.
Fishing is not like it used to be. When I first started, you know, fishing's got less and less. More boats on fishing and more powerful boats fishing at the moment. And, you know, it's getting a bit of a struggle, really, with some people, you know. But we have to go every time we possibly can when the weather's fine. And so the stocks are certainly a lot less than what they used to be. We fish mainly for flatfish, whitings, soles, you know, quite a mixture of fish in this sort of area, you know, but obviously it's not the quantity as used to be, you know. But there is quite a mixture of fish. And we usually go mainly day fishing, you know, we do 12 to 14 hours. We fish on average between 6 to 8 miles, on an average between 6 to 8 miles. But we do go further afield, but it's only when the fishing is very scarce, you know, we just wander about, so to speak. It's between 6 and 8 miles, I would imagine, you know. We do fish a bit closer in at times, you know, but in that sort of area.
It was the friars, eremites of St Augustine, that built this medieval monastery in 1379. Now only the walls remain, for the building has undergone many changes over the ensuing centuries. Its present use is as a pottery, one of several that have made Rye internationally famous. It was here that a monk called Cantata is said to have fallen in love and eloped with a beautiful young girl named Amanda. The two were caught and buried alive for their sins. Years later, labourers constructing the Southeastern Railway came across two skeletons clasped in each other's arms. It's said that their ghosts still haunt Turkey Cock Lane. Rye has been famous for its pottery for as long as anyone can remember, a tradition carried on with skills handed down through generations of craftsmen. This is the Cinque Ports pottery, and there are numerous others around Rye, each producing their own distinctive style. Many have a connection to Rye pottery, the town's oldest, found here in Ferry Road.
Well, there's been a pottery on this site since about the 13th century, on this clay pit. But this building was only built as a pottery in 1869. Just this one room deep, but 3 floors tall. And the kiln was out the back, separated away because it's a fire risk, just like the kitchens were in early mansions. They put the kitchen in a separate building with a...
Because it burned hot poles?
Yes.
Yes.
But this was only a branch of a pottery just down the road. It was the younger brother moving away from his dad and his elder brother because he wanted to do fine potting as opposed to chimney pots and dairy crocks and bricks and tiles and things like that. And so this was the culmination of his life's work.
And some of the pieces we've got here
are in the showcase
That's
there.
what they used to make.
Yeah. But sadly, he died after he'd been here 5 or 6 years. But his widow carried on for another 21 years with a spinner, or which is a thrower, as they call them down here in Sussex. And their nephew was brought in. So that family had this pottery here 150 years, something like that. And he bought it off his boss. And it goes back and back and back and back. And there are samples of medieval pots up in the museum that go back to about the second half of the 13th century.
The machinery in this old Rye pumping station was originally turned by a horse gin, though it was replaced by a steam engine in 1867. The water was pumped through pipes up Conduit Hill, finally to reach this storage reservoir in Church Square. It was built in 1735. Just around the corner is the town hall, dating from 1742.
Forward, march. Left wheel. Mind your muskets and the flag.
It was here that the Cinque Ports militia often paraded, as they do today, but only as an echo from the past. On the wall in the council chamber is a roll of honour of all the mayors of Rye since 1289. Rye was a so-called rotten borough, but it boasted some famous members of Parliament, such as Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington. Here in the Church of St Mary the Virgin, religion and politics come together. The mayor's seat. The church is Norman, though little of that period remains. It was reduced to a smouldering ruin after the French attack of 1377. This turret clock is said to be the oldest working clock in England. It was probably a gift from Queen Elizabeth I when she visited Rye in 1573. Its enormous pendulum swinging from the church ceiling was added much later. The historian Samuel Jeake Sr. described Rye Church as the goodliest edifice of that kind in the counties of Kent and Sussex, the cathedral excepted. Others have indeed called it the Cathedral of East Sussex. Certainly it's a sizable church and has some of the most beautiful stained glass windows to be found anywhere. The church register of December the 20th, 1579 records the baptism of John Fletcher. He was born at the old vicarage in Rye and grew up to become famous as a dramatist and a collaborator with Shakespeare. He died of the plague in London in 1625, but his memory is still perpetuated by this board in the lane outside. From its prominent position, the church tower offers some of the finest views of Rye and the Romney Marsh. Similar riches stand in the surrounding square, a unique collection of period buildings with hardly two the same. A recent addition, this beautiful church was built in Spanish Roman style in 1929, a veritable miniature basilica flanked by Roman columns. The Byzantine cross was a gift from the author Radcliffe Hall. Dedicated to St Anthony of Padua, it's a breath of the Mediterranean in England's green and pleasant land. In contrast, a conventional chapel stands directly opposite. It's now a private house.
Well, I first came to Rye in 1974, and that was after reading E.F. Benson's novels, the Mata Lucia series that was set here. It was the most exciting day to actually come and look around the town that figures in those novels. And then I was founding secretary of the E.F. Benson Society. That was formed in 1984, and I've been visiting the town ever since, roughly every year. You just have to have a yearly fix of Rye, and I now have the great pleasure of living here. Many writers have lived in Rye. One of the first ones to move here in this century, or just at the end of the last century, was Henry James. And he moved here in 1898 to get away from the crowds of London and to try and settle down and write novels in peace and quiet. He was visited here by many famous writers as well, most notable of which was Edith Wharton and also G.K. Chesterton.
The house and garden were given to the National Trust in 1950 to be preserved as an enduring symbol of the ties that unite the British and American people. It was once the home of the Lamb family, who headed Rye's political society. To Henry James, it was his inspirational retreat. Here he completed the Wings of the Dove, the Ambassadors, and the Golden Bowl, each considered a masterpiece. He wrote his books in the garden room that formerly stood here. The building was destroyed in an air raid on August the 18th, 1940. Only a scale model remains to show us what it looked like. The model stands in a glass case here in the dining room. This garden is little changed from James's time. He wasn't a gardener himself, but he enjoyed every detail of it, looking out with pride from his garden room. And here, a gallery of friends lovingly preserved.
E.F. Benson took out a lease here, or a sublease, in 1916, and then shared the full lease with his brother from 1919 until 1925, when his brother died, and he maintained the lease until his own death in 1940. Some of the other famous writers that lived in Rye were Radcliffe Hall. She lived here from 1928 onwards in various houses in Rye. Also Margaret Irwin, the famous historical novelist. She was here in Rye. There's also, of course, Rumer Godden. She lived at Lamb House as well in the 1960s, as did Montgomery Hyde, who was a famous biographer, and he wrote about Oscar Wilde and the 1890s circle. More recently, there was Patrick Dickinson, the poet. He lived in Church Square, and there was also Eric Welton, which some people may remember. He wrote a series of travel books in the 1950s and 60s. Rye's always been a haven for writers, ever since Henry James came here, and there's always been a thriving artistic community, painters and writers living here in Rye.
There's another side of Rye which many a filmmaker and writer has been fascinated by, and it's of a very different character.
From about the 12th century to the 15th century, Rye was a haven not only for fishermen, for traders, but also for pirates. And in fact, our seamen were quite notorious for this. They controlled the channel and were very good at capturing people, bringing them back here and holding them for ransom. In later years, this developed into whole-scale smuggling, and smuggling ranged for centuries, and indeed I wouldn't be surprised if some doesn't still go on now. Across the marsh were all sorts of secret trails. The houses in Rye had special secret cupboards, secret stairways. All the attics ran from one to the other, so a person could get up in one end of the house and end up through the attics in the end of the street. So smuggling has been a way of life in Rye.
Rye is dotted with smugglers' haunts. Here they drank away the day, awaiting the cover of night. The 15th century Mermaid Inn in Mermaid Street was the headquarters of the Hawkhurst gang, the most ruthless of them all. Its rooms have sheltered others too, highwaymen among them. This street, dubbed the most beautiful in England, was once a no-go area for residents. Fights and rowdiness were so common here that it's not surprising to find the old hospital, Hartshorn House, located at only a short distance. It's not far from Traders' Passage, a steep path that climbs to one of the highest points in Rye. Here we find another tavern, the Hope Anchor Inn. From this vantage point, seasoned watchers spent many a cold, wet night, their eyes peering out into the darkness, for this was the site of the old watch bell, to be rung in case of invasion. The town was also a sink port, and very proud of it, one of a select few southern harbours given the Royal Charter in the 11th century.
Cinque Port means that we were chosen by the king to defend the realm. In exchange for us allowing him our ships and our sailors for about 15 days a year, he allowed us to rule ourselves. And this was very important in a time when hardly anybody could move without the permission of the lord of the manor within the country. Rye had its own council, it didn't pay any taxes, and it could accept all money from trade and so on. It was a very privileged position. The king's influence in Rye as a Cinque Port was controlled by the bailiff. He had a mace carried in front of him to defend him. The town's interest was looked after by the mayor, and he also had a mace in front of him. And these two officers ran the town for the Cinque Ports arrangements, organising, shipping, trade, etc. Rye, in fact, has 4 maces. We have the 2 medieval iron maces, which were to defend the mayor and the bailiff, and they were covered in Tudor times with silver. And then in about the 1760s, we decided that we would have really big silver gilt ones, which are absolutely magnificent, and they have all the elements for a coronation.
There never was a coronation in Rye, but it was visited by a king, George I, that is.
He enjoyed the hospitality of Rye so much that before his departure, he agreed to act as godfather to Lamb's child. And he was indeed as good as his word.
George Lamb, I hereby baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
This remarkable scale model of Rye is the work of Joy Harland. Her husband Ted was responsible for the lighting, and visitors are daily treated to a spectacular sound and light show that brings Rye's history alive. Rye's Heritage Centre on Strand Quay is the ideal starting point from which to discover the town. Rye has been a busy market town since long before the 13th century.
We have Rye Market here every Wednesday throughout the year. We have lambs, hoggets and ewes coming into the market from the local farmers. Generally we have about 1,000, on average about 1,000 sheep every week. It's a little seasonal. Obviously at certain times of the year we have more, and other times not quite so many.
Rye is a wonderful area for the rural economy of the country. I have farmed on the Romney Marsh for 30 years. I bring my sheep to Rye every week, and it is just a wonderful way of life. Do come to the Romney Marsh and Rye and travel across and see all these wonderful animals in the pasture fields.
Double bed, there we go, big strong ewes there, straight in for those there, 35 for them, 35, on to go then, surely. Well, where do you want to start? Got 3 to start, yes, £3, what, £33? £33 on big now, 20 if you like, £33 on big, double bed, yes, big strong ewes there, £33 on big now, 20 if you like, £33 on big, £33 on